Sarah Humphreys here from Edward and the White Bear. In my last video I showed you how to make quick pieced half square triangles, which is a component that comes up time and time again in patchwork blocks. Another really useful component is the quarter square triangle. So I have an example of each just here. So this first one is a half square triangle, and that's a square with a diagonal seam through the middle, and there's usually a different fabric either side. So that's the half square triangle. So not surprisingly, the quarter square triangle, square again, but this time there are two seams through it, which gives us 4 smaller triangles or 4 quarter triangles. When you're thinking about your measurements for the quarter square triangle, because there's a couple of seams and we want space to trim up, I normally cut my initial squares 1.5 inches bigger than the final finished quarter square triangle. So I have 2 squares here. These are cut at 5.5, which will give me a finished quarter square triangle at 4 inches when it's sewn into the block. So these start in a very similar way to the half square triangle, well, an identical way to the half square triangle. So I'll go to the back of one of my squares. I'm going to draw a diagonal line corner to corner, just with a pencil or chalk or whatever you use to mark. There we go, so a diagonal line corner to corner on my square. I'm then going to sew 1/4 inch either side of that line. So right sides together, line those up nice and neatly, right sides of my fabrics and my drawn line on top, and I'm going to take that to my sewing machine. So I've taken my squares to the sewing machine. Just check before I stitch that the fabrics are right side together, which they are, all lined up. I don't usually use pins at this stage, the fabric tends to stay together quite nicely. I'm running the 1/4 inch guide of my foot down just to the right of this drawn line. So if we just set off, there we go. And keep that nice and straight down that line. So that's down one side, 1/4 inch from the drawn line. If I just turn that round, and I'm now going to sew 1/4 inch down the other side. Okay, so I have my 2 squares right sides together, line down the middle and a sewn line 1/4 inch either side. I'm going to take that to my cutting board and just cut that in half. So as with the half square triangle, I'm going to cut these in half down that drawn line. So I have 2, and these do make the half square triangles to begin with as before. Still with that useful mat that's got cutting on one side and pressing on the other. Press from the top as always, and then I'm going to press to the orange with these. So right into that seam, make sure that goes nice and flat, and then repeat with my second half square triangle. Press from the top first and then press right into that seam. So with the half square triangles, I got to that stage, trimmed them up, and they were ready to go. But we're working with a quarter square triangle, so we've got a second stage. So I'll turn one of them over, and I'm going to draw a diagonal line going in the opposite direction to that seam line. So again, I'm lining up corner to corner, but I'm also making sure that a line in my ruler is running along that seam line, just to make sure that I'm at right angles when I'm drawing this line. So drawn line going corner to corner in the opposite direction to the first seam line. And then I'm going to put these two pieces together. So I want to match my green to my orange here and my orange to my green there. And I want to make the central seam lines come together. And I'm rolling between my fingers and my thumb. I've got my fingers on the back. So I'm rolling between my fingers and my thumb. I've got my fingers on the back so I can feel those two seams coming together. And as far as possible, making all four edges line up. Now on this occasion I am going to pin. So I'm going to pin on each side. So begin with on the left, make sure that I can feel those seams together and then pin to hold those seams. And if I want to check that, I can peel that back and just check that I can see my seams coming together at this point. Turn it round, same on the other side, so make sure that I can feel those coming together. And again, I'm pinning through the seam to hold it in place, and I can check by opening it up that those seams are coming together. If there's a gap between the two seams, just take a moment to readjust and make sure that they're nestling in together. And then I'm going to go back to the machine. So I'm back to my machine and I'm ready to do the second set of sewing on these quarter square triangles. So as before, I'm lining up the 1/4 inch mark just to the side of that line. Just make sure you hold that central seam in place as you get to it to stop your foot flipping it over. And if you've got needle down, work with that so you can adjust your foot if you need to. So as I get to that seam and that pin's getting in my way, I can slide it out but make sure I don't disturb where I've got pinned. And come off the end there. So I've got a 1/4 inch seam on one side of that drawn line, turn it round and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch the other side as well. So same again, as I get to that pin I can just slide it out my way, holding onto that central seam so I don't disturb it. So you can see I've got my two squares, right sides together, opposite colours facing, drawn line down the middle, and I've sewn 1/4 inch either side of that line. Take that back to my cutting board. So I'm back to my cutting board and I'm going to start by cutting this in half along that drawn line. And that gives me 2 1/4 square triangle units. So I'm going to give those a press. Now at this stage you are starting to build up a little bit of bulk at the back. I still like to press the seam to one side, but if you prefer you can press that seam open. It's really a matter of personal preference. Again, I'm pressing from the top first and then right into that seam to make it lie nice and flat. And you can see, because I just took time to make sure that those central seams lined up when I was stitching them, I should get a lovely middle to that 1/4 square triangle unit. Same again, so if I start with 2 squares, I will always end up with 2 units, whether that's half square triangles or 1/4 square triangles. And then the last stage is to square those up, so trim them to make them the right size and nice and neat. So back to my cutting board. So I started with 5.5 inch squares, which will trim down to 4.5 inches, and that will then give me the seam allowance for a 4 inch finished 1/4 square triangle. So to trim it up, like with your half square triangles, I want to look at that diagonal, but I also need to look at the central point. So to trim to 4.5, I take it to 2.25 at that central point. So I can see just in the middle there the 2.25 inch line, so that's half of what I want. diagonal line through the middle. Plenty of weight on because there's quite a lot of bulk with those seams, and just trim the right hand edge if you're right-handed. You'll go the opposite way if you're left-handed, and the top as well. So once that's done, I can turn it around 180 degrees so the top right comes down to bottom left, and this time I'm looking at the 4.5 inch line there. My diagonal line should still go through the middle, and I should still have that 4.25 inch point centrally, and I can trim those two edges as well. So we should end up with a lovely 4.5 inch quarter square triangle. The diagonals are coming to the corner and my centre point is central. So that was how to make a quick pieced quarter square triangle, perfect for use in lots of patchwork blocks. If you've got any other blocks or hints and tips that you'd like to see me do let me know in the comments, and otherwise I'll see you again soon.